here. Before I talk to you about what my idea of nature's best hope is, I want to revisit what happened last fall. At least on the East Coast, I think it happened all the way to the Mississippi. All the red oaks got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. We call that an oak mast. It's what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and just started staring at it, and I was rewarded. An insect started to chew its way out of the acorn, and it chewed a little hole and then squeezed its way through. Kind of looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally plopped down to the ground. Very dangerous time for this insect larva because it tastes good. Lots of things want to eat it. So it's got to get to safety, and it does that by wiggling some more. It works its way down below the ground in about 30 seconds, where it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber, and within that chamber converts itself to a pupa. And then it stays in that chamber as a pupa for 2 years. Then it comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down here. Females take those mouth parts, chew a hole down into the center of the acorn, then turn around and lay an egg in that hole, and that's how the larva gets down there. You might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Red oak acorns take 18 months to develop. So if they came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. That, of course, leaves a hole, a true vacuum. You all know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants that live in the vacated holes made by acorn weevils inside of acorns. And if they find a brand new acorn with a brand new hole, they get excited because their old acorn's falling apart at this point. So they tell everybody in the colony, and the first thing they do is start to move that colony in. So they all work hard. It takes about 30 minutes, depending on how far away the colony is. But once they're inside, they post a guard, make sure nobody else comes in, and they'll live there for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. Well, about this time, my wife says, what's your point? What are you trying to tell us? What I'm trying to tell you is that's just one of literally millions of highly specialized interactions that comprise most of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays, of course, are the primary dispersers of acorns. They fly up to 2 miles away from a parent tree with an acorn, tap it below the surface of the ground, and then they supposedly go and get it during the winter to eat, but they don't remember very well, and they only remember where they buried about a quarter of those acorns. They bury about 4,000 some odd acorns for each jay, but if they only recover a quarter, they've actually planted about 3,000 oak trees every year per jay. You won't have pileated woodpeckers near you if you don't have lots of carpenter ants, because that is what they rear their young on, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. Have you ever wondered what pollinates witch hazel? I mean, it's blooming right now, and you go and you look at those flowers, you hardly ever see anything. Well, it turns out it's a group of moths called winter moths. They're actually sallows. This is the bicolored sallow. I took a picture the other night at my house. And they're the primary pollinators of our witch hazels. They fly very late. That's why they're called winter moths. Now, I don't know whether witch hazel started to bloom late to take advantage of winter moths, or whether winter moths flew late to take advantage of witch hazel, but at this point, they both depend on each other. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have Phacelia. It's the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And pollen specialization turns out to be very common among our bees. We've got about 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them are highly specialized on particular pollen. So for example, there's at least 13 species of native bees that only reproduce on the pollen of perennial sunflowers. You won't have Baltimore checkered spots unless you have white turtlehead, and then on and on and on. So nature is truly a series of very specialized relationships. But today, these relationships, nature itself, is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, the state of Arizona decided it was going to mine the Grand Canyon, but Teddy got wind of that, and he went to the canyon, stood on the edge, looked out over the grand view, and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of forming the Grand Canyon National Park. The problem, of course, today is that leaving the country as it was is no longer an option, because we didn't do that. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine condition. And that's because we have logged it repeatedly. We've tilled it, we've drained it, we've grazed it. You know, we have 770 million acres of rangeland in the U.S., which is 4.5 times the size of Texas. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We have drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of them running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up the ecosystems around us into tiny remnants of their former self. And each of those remnants are too small and too isolated from other remnants to sustain the species that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. Why have we done this? Well, it's a good question. I think we just felt that the Earth, our nest, was so large, we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we're seeing headlines like this. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. That's 1/3 of the North American bird population gone. The UN now predicts that we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, possibly within the next 20 years. And I love the way they present these headlines as if it's just another headline. I mean, they might as well say, we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years and then go on to the next headline. This is not an option, folks. This is simply not an option. Well, I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses, but that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. And it's a cure that's going to take small efforts from a lot of people, but they will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return to this headline briefly. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, E.O. Wilson, the most famous entomologist of all times, still alive, still writing, Harvard emeritus. He told us what it would mean if we lost our insects, and he did it way back in 1987 in this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. His message was very simple. Life as we know it depends on insects, and if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, not only would that change the physical structure of our terrestrial habitats, but it would drastically inhibit energy flow through those ecosystems. In other words, the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals, and even our freshwater fish would collapse and they would all disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot as opposed to the rapid turnover of nutrients that we have because of insect decomposers right now. If we were to lose those decomposers, we would only have bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans would not survive any of those drastic changes. The good news is, of course, that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on what we call ecosystem services produced by healthy ecosystems. These are just a few things that plants give us. We talk about us, but they deliver it to all things on the planet. Oxygen, they produce oxygen, they clean our water and keep it from moving quickly to the sea where it's too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important ecosystem service today. Plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere 24/7, well, actually during the day, I guess. Taking that carbon, building their tissues out of it, and then pumping the extra carbon from their roots into the ground. Our soils are brown or black because of carbon that plant roots have deposited there over the eons. Plants build topsoil, they hold it in place, they prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, lots of very important things. What do animals do for plants? Well, they provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds, and of course, other things. So designing landscapes like this is simply not an option. It never was a good option, but designing landscapes that don't produce ecosystem services, when we have 7.8, 7.9 billion people on the planet, that's a non-starter right there. So we have to learn how to not do that. Now, during the ages, throughout the ages, there were visionaries who recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with the planet. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said was that the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. We humans have been terrible at that. I mean, there have been some, well, there are many indigenous groups that have lived extensive periods of times without spoiling their land. But our huge capitalistic Western societies, the huge Asian societies, the ones dominating the planet right now, are terrible at living on the earth without spoiling it. We go from one place to another, take more than the earth has to offer. Then we go to another place and do the same thing. So Aldo had a dream that we actually would develop what he called a land ethic. In his dream, we would use the earth. We have to use, we have to farm it and lumber it and graze it, mine it, do all of those things. But we learn to do it without destroying local ecosystems. And that's what he called his land ethic. He wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he didn't talk about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect it was because the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's times, but it's still embedded in our own, that he may not have actually recognized it as an option. What I'm going to argue tonight, though, is that living with nature not only is an option, it is now the only viable option that is left to us. Of course, in the past, conservationists worked almost exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. What we have to do now is flip that on its head. We have to save nature. Actually, we've got to reconstruct it where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much every place. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Where are we going to do that? Well, let's return to this piece of private property here. 85.6% of the U.S. east of the Mississippi is privately owned. I think 75% of the entire country is privately owned. If we ignored private property, if we did not do any conservation on private property, we would fail, because then we'd be working with areas that are too small and too isolated from each other to sustain, again, the nature that we need. There are actually a lot of places that we don't typically think of as options for conservation that we need to start thinking about. How about power and pipeline rights of ways? You realize we have over 300 million kilometers of power lines in this country. That's 21 million acres that could be used effectively towards scrub habitat conservation. Railroad rights of ways, another 3 million acres. The roadsides, 17 million acres. Golf courses are 2 million acres. Airports, 3 million acres. You know, the Denver airport is twice the size of Manhattan. Then we have all the places where we live, both in rural areas, suburbia, our cities, hundreds of millions of acres in those areas. If you add up just that, and you can think of other places, that's 599 million acres that we could be doing some level of conservation on. How big is 599 million acres? Well, it is bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, Virginia, New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, plus Montana, plus California. Even throw Texas in there. Not having a place to do conservation is not the issue. We can do it pretty much anywhere. Now, when I use the word conservation, I'm not really using it correctly. I'm talking about going to areas where we've already dismantled most of nature and putting it back together again. So we're not conserving pristine ecosystems. We're going to rebuild them. So it's some form of restoration, but a lot of people say, well, you're not going to put back exactly what was there before we humans came and messed it up. And that is true. We've changed too many things, but we can reassemble many of those specialized interactions that I was just talking about so that we have a functioning ecosystem again, producing those ecosystem services. But we have to start with the species that are the building blocks of ecosystems. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to start with the ones that other species depend on. And the first thing we need to do is to rebuild a food web. The food web, of course, starts with plants. Plants are capturing energy from the sun and turning it into food. And that's the food that supports all the animals on the planet. Now, most animals don't eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants, and that something is typically insects. And it turns out that the insects that transfer more energy from plants to other animals, more than any other type of plant eater, are caterpillars. So if we lost caterpillars from our ecosystems, most of the energy would remain locked up in plants, and we would have failed food webs. Let's use the Carolina chickadee as an example. You have the black-capped chickadee in Prospect Park. Chickadees, of course, are seed eaters during the winter. You know, we see them at our feeders all the time. where we think they're eating seeds all the time, but it's actually only 50% of their diet during the winter is seeds. The other 50% are insects. But when they're reproducing, their babies can't eat seeds. So they switch to insects. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on insects. And in fact, they are not exceptions. Most of our birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, there's lots of lines of evidence that suggest that. But one of my recent grad students, Ashley Kennedy, did a citizen science project where she actually got a pretty good handle on it. She put out a call for people to, mostly bird photographers, take pictures of birds as they were bringing food to the nest all over the country. A lot of excellent bird photographers out there, and they sent her thousands of pictures. And from those pictures, she identified the prey item that was in the beak and reconstructed the nestling diet of 20 of the common bird families in North America. The green bars are the percentage of the nestling diet that was caterpillars. And in 16 of the 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominated the nestling diet. So again, remember what would, or think about what would happen if we took the caterpillars out of the system. Most of the birds would not be able to reproduce effectively. So there's something special about caterpillars. What is it? Actually, there's several things special about caterpillars, and one of them is that they are soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The sausage, or the wrapper is exoskeleton, it's cuticle. It is undigestible, and birds don't want a lot of that. And because it's very thin, then the caterpillar is soft, and that means you can stuff it down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring the esophagus or the stomach. And if you've ever watched a parent bird feed its young, they're pretty rough. Their beak is like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? Caterpillars are also nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin compared to most other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages, they're like little tanks. And much of a beetle is undigestible, and they've got a lot of sharp edges. And it turns out the caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate, and you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. We have to get them from plants, and we have to get them from plants because they are essential components of our diets. And that's why my wife Cindy says I have to eat my carrots to get my beta carotene, and my tomatoes to get my lycopene, my whatever that is to get my lutein. And she makes sure I eat all those things because they stimulate my immune system. And I cannot think of a better time to have a very strong immune system. They're also antioxidants. They run around our body, protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. They improve sperm vitality, improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about things like this male prothonotary warbler. He is bright yellow because he's had access to lots of luteins. He takes those luteins, makes pigments out of them, puts them in his feathers, and the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. Well, where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? From what they're eating, but carotenoid levels are not equal across bird prey items. These first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey items. The third bar are orthopterides, things like crickets, grasshoppers, and katydids. Here are the adult caterpillars down here, the moths and the butterflies themselves. Far fewer carotenoids than the caterpillars because they're not eating green leaves. It's the caterpillars that are eating green leaves. And here is the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. Where are they, or does this influence their hunting decisions and what they're bringing back to the nest? Well, Ashley did another study where she put GoPro cameras on the roofs of bluebird houses, and those GoPro cameras took a picture once a second. The object was to get a good picture of the bluebirds as they flew into the nest with prey to feed the babies. And a lot of times the birds landed on the roof of the box and posed, and we got lots of good pictures. Well, she had a lot of GoPro cameras and a lot of bluebirds nests, and she did it for 3 years. So she had over 1 million pictures to go through. But out of that 1 million pictures, she got 7,628 pictures, good enough where she could identify the prey item. And there was a very nice relationship. The prey they brought back most often was caterpillars, and they have the highest carotenoids, followed by those orthopteroids, which have the next highest. And then everybody else with low levels is nested down here. So all this suggests that at least for birds, caterpillars may not be optional parts of the diet. It's really starting to look like they are essential parts of bird diet. So let's just say birds need caterpillars. Okay, how many do they need though? Is one or two enough? Well, let's go back to chickadees. We've got a lot of data on chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a clutch of chickadees? One or two is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to bring one clutch of chickadees to the point where they fledge, depending on the number of chicks in the nest. And after they fledge, the parents continue to feed those babies caterpillars for another 24 days before the babies are completely independent. But they're flying all around, so nobody's counted that. But you're talking about many thousands of caterpillars to make a bird that is a third of an ounce. And if you want them breeding in your yard, and you do want them breeding in your yard, because that's pretty much all that's left in a great part of the country, we need all those caterpillars within 50 meters of the nest. That's what the average foraging distance for chickadees is for most birds, very close to the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we landscape in a way that does not create that many caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And there's a lot of evidence, growing evidence, that insect decline is one of the major drivers of the bird declines that we're measuring. We went to the original data set that from Rosenberg et al. That said we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the birds up into two groups: the birds that for which insects are absolutely essential, at least at one part of their life history, and it's typically when they're breeding, and birds that don't ever require insects. So a lot of our finches and doves and a few other groups can reproduce on seeds alone. They actually gained some numbers in the last 50 years, but the birds that require insects on average lost 10 million individuals per species in the last 50 years. Now, this doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly is suggestive that there is a relationship between declining insects and declining birds. So I am convinced that we need to start landscaping for caterpillars. They truly are driving our food webs. And that, of course, is a very different goal for the way we've been landscaping in the past. In the past, we've wanted to landscape in a way that where our landscapes had no insects at all. Insects were bad. We're going to kill them all. Can't do that anymore. So how do we add caterpillars to landscapes? Well, you do that by adding the plants that make those caterpillars, that support their growth and development. There is a catch, though, and that is that most plants don't do that. Most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars, so we have to pick the ones that do. Why don't all plants support caterpillars? Because caterpillars are really fussy about what they eat, and the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You can have your Callery pear, or your crepe myrtle, or your boxwood, or your hosta, or any of the other ornamentals that we put in our yards, typically from Asia, and you're not going to support any monarchs at all unless you have milkweeds. That is the only plant they're going to use to develop successfully, and they're not exceptions. Most of our insects that eat plants are what we call host plant specialists. Why? Because plants have made them specialists. Plants don't want to be eaten. Plants want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their tissues with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those tissues either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And if you don't believe me, next spring, go outside and get a green leaf and eat it and see if you like it. I don't care which leaf you pick. See if you like it. You're not going to like it. All plant lineages are defending themselves from insects with nasty chemicals. And that's why it's green out there in the summer. It's not because there are no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. There is a reason it is hard to get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know that they're toxic. Yes, that's my little joke. But this is not a joke. Insects do eat plants. We know that. How do they do that? If the plants are so well defended, how do they eat them and get away with it? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants will specialize on only one or two types of plants, one or two lineages of plants that are having a very similar type of chemical defense. all plant lineages are protecting themselves in a different way, and insects cannot adapt to all of them at the same time. So they pick and choose, like the monarch picks just the milkweeds. And they develop the enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify the compounds in that plant lineage, the behavioral adaptations, the life history adaptations that minimize their exposure to those compounds. It takes a long period of evolutionary exposure to these plants for all those adaptations to fall into place. It does not happen overnight. But when they do fall into place, the insects can eat the plants without dying. All I'm saying here is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to rebuild food webs in any particular place where we've dismantled them, we've got to choose the plants that are going to support the food webs. In other words, we've got to choose the plants that make those caterpillars that drive those food webs, or it's not going to work. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work when we choose the right plants. And I'm going to start with our house here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. We have 10 acres of a farm that was broken up. I'm sitting in this window right now. It was an old farm. I mean, it was farmed from the late 1600s on, so 300 plus years. And the farm was exhausted. I mean, the last thing they did was mow it for hay, but what they were really mowing were all the invasive species that had come in: multiflora rose and Oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and autumn olive and miscanthus and on and on. They mowed all that and called that hay. So when we started building a house, of course, the mowing had stopped. And by the time we were finished, this is what the entire 10 acres looked like. It was just a tangle of, this is Oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and multiflora rose, and kind of looked like Sleeping Beauty's castle. This is my wife, Cindy. She's getting ready to get rid of all this stuff, which she did. So you have a bad invasive species problem. And of course, you folks there have done a wonderful job in getting rid of your buckthorn. You know that you can do it. It's a lot of work, but don't give up. You really can do it. Cindy, she likes doing it. I mean, but she should be a role model for you, because it does work. What was I doing while she was working hard? I was telling her she was doing a great job, but I was also putting the plants back, and I did it selfishly. My little hobby is to take pictures of caterpillars. So I figured I would put the plants back to attract caterpillars that I'd never seen before. They ought to be here, but they weren't here. And I was going to start with a Canadian owlet. I didn't know if it would work, but in order to have Canadian owlets and they're adult that looks just like leaves, you have to have meadow rue. We didn't have any meadow rue. I mean, again, all the plants were gone. And there's no meadow rue around us. I still haven't found any meadow rue close by. So I planted some seeds from someplace else, and it grew very nicely. But I didn't know whether I would ever attract Canadian owlets. I certainly didn't think I would attract them very quickly. So I didn't check my meadow rue. And after about a month and a half, I just happened to be walking by. I said, oh, they're growing nicely. Uh-oh, look, they're almost defoliated by Canadian owlets. That moth had found them right away. Don't know where it came from, but and now we have a good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets. So there we go. I've added 2 species to our little ecosystem. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. This beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa. Call it ditch daisy. I did know where there was some Biden's aristosa about 14 miles away in a power line cut. So I got some seeds of Biden's, planted them, grew very nicely. Well, it took about a year for the moth to find our Biden's, but they're there now. I've got a good population of both. So now we've added 4 species to the property. Wanted hackberry emperor. It's a butterfly that should be here, but like the name suggests, it requires hackberry. We didn't have any hackberry, long gone. So I planted hackberry. This took, it was either 3 or 4 years before the butterfly discovered our hackberry, but now we have a good population. I walked by one of my hackberries this June, and on a single branch, there were 9 hackberry emperor caterpillars. So big success. There you go, 6 species added. I did not plant goldenrod, came in on its own, and along with it came many of the things that eat goldenrod. Goldenrod in my neck of the woods supports 110 species of caterpillars, things like the brown-hooded owlet, the Arsidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. Now this is what I'm waiting for, the goldenrod flower moth, and its larvae. It has not found our goldenrod yet. I don't know why. So this is anticipation. This is like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. I go out every year and look for my goldenrod flower moth. One of these years I'm going to find it, and that'll be a great day. Planted Virginia creeper. People don't like Virginia creeper. I don't know why. It's a beautiful plant. It can climb up our trees and play nice. It doesn't strangle them, doesn't pull them down, and it supports wonderful caterpillars like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, and many other types of caterpillars. Wanted the zebra swallowtail because I think it's our prettiest swallowtail. Well, it's a specialist on pawpaw. Now I was pushing it because we are at the northern limit of both pawpaw and the zebra swallowtail. As a matter of fact, the closest population I know of is 26 miles south of us, and I didn't know whether they ever would find us. Well, we collected some pawpaws, ate them, planted the seeds, and then we waited 9 years. But they finally found us. So we've got a good population of both now. In the meantime, the pawpaw sphinx came. I didn't know there was a pawpaw sphinx. And of course, we got lots of pawpaws. One of the double-tooth prominent because it's a very cool looking caterpillar. It's a specialist on elms. So I planted American elm and we got the caterpillar right away. One of the evening primrose moth because it's beautiful and I like beauty just like everybody else. So we planted evening primrose and the moth came and it spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. It's very cute. And we planted lots of oaks. Now, these are just examples of the trees, the plants that we put into our property. But I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. But this is the mistake a lot of people make. They think your oaks have to be enormous before they can contribute meaningfully to your property. I hear people say all the time, I'm not going to plant an oak. I won't live long enough to enjoy it. Well, unless you die before the next year, you can enjoy what your oak is doing for your property because right away they will start to attract the things that use oaks. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns and the rest is 2-foot bare root whips. And right away, they brought in things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, the orange-headed epicalema, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bugulatrix, the white blotch heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to our oaks. And they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a crocus geometer standing on the ground eating the leaves of that plant. You don't have to wait hundreds of years before your plants start to support the life around you. This is a picture of our property from the same place I took that first picture. I'm still sitting in this window up here. I just want to show you we're very traditional. We have lawn here, but we've put plants back. I'm still putting plants back. I have no idea what the original plant diversity was, but we haven't reached it. I can guarantee that. But I noticed that every time I put a new plant lineage into our yard, we get new species of moths. And 4 years ago, I made it a goal to take a picture of every moth species that I could find on our property. I am up to 1,028 species of moths that I found right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. Now remember, we have 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the land area, we have 40% of all the moth species that occur in Pennsylvania. And because each one of these moths is bird food, we have recorded 59 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres, not flown by, but bred. So it works. It works. You put the plants back, life comes. I saw this, well, we all saw this headline. I guess it's 3 weeks ago at this point. World Wildlife Fund says Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. And I'm thinking, not at our house. As a matter of fact, I'm willing to wager that we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3. And it didn't, not since 1970, a lot shorter period of time than that, which means this is reversible. These are terrible headlines, but it's reversible. All we have to do, and by we, I mean everybody, is put the plants back. All the places we've taken them away, and we can turn these terrible statistics around. But I know what you're thinking. We have 10 acres and you might live in suburbia. You don't have 10 acres. Will it work on smaller properties? That's a good question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. And they live in a typical suburban neighborhood. They have 0.6 acres, so 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. And they're surrounded by neighbors with the big lawns, a very typical suburban situation. I visited the Terpstras just before the virus broke out. And they explained the first thing they did was get rid of their invasive species. And the biggest one there was bush honeysuckle. And they got rid of that. Then they planted a bunch of native plants. And they also installed what they call a bubbler. It bubbles up here, and it's a little water feature for the birds. And then they sat back and started to count the birds. And they're up to 149 species of birds that have used their yard, 35 warbler species. Just to put that in perspective, we've only recorded 8 warbler species. That's almost all the warblers in the country that have come to the Terpstra's house. And again, it's just over half acre. So yes, it can work on smaller properties. Can it work in urban yards? Well, let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I do mean in Chicago. She lives right next to one of the runways of O'Hare Airport. It's right over this wall here. The planes come in right over her house. She lives right next to Kennedy Expressway. And she has 1/10 of an acre. That is 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She is also an island. She is not connected to any type of natural area at all. So she's a little island kind of in the middle of this urban sprawl. Well, she got rid of her invasive species, put in 60 species of native plants, put in a water feature for the birds, and then she started to count her birds. And she's up to 116 species of birds that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, you can go to Pam's house and check it out. What about city centers? 82% of us live in cities. Well, in 2014, I was staring at this plant, Asclepias tuberosa. People call it butterfly weed, but that reminds me, we have a marketing issue with our native plants. We call them weeds and then wonder why people don't plant them. So we're not going to call it butterfly weed anymore. We're going to call it Monarch's Delight. All right, I was staring at Monarch's Delight, and the first thing I saw were 2 species of leafcutter bees, 2 species of megachilid bees. I know they're megachilids because they carry their pollen on their tummy, not on their legs. And one of those species I hadn't seen in years, so that was good. I was impressed because leafcutter bees have very specific needs. Not only do they need pollen and nectar, they also need soft leaves. Leaves typical of what redbud makes. Redbud's perfect for leafcutter bees. They cut the edges out of those leaves, roll them up, and stuff them with pollen, and then they take the whole package and put it in a crack or a crevice. There was a redbud growing right next to Monarch's Delight, and that would explain why the leafcutter bees are there. But because there's a redbud there, of course, it blooms early in the spring, providing a lot of forage for queen bumblebees. It's queens that overwinter. There are no workers, and so the queens have to do all the work in the spring. They've got to rear the entire first brood through so that they have workers, and they need a lot of very efficient forage early in the season, or their colony fails. Well, there were bumblebees there, so obviously the redbud was doing its job. Then I saw a monarch. Actually, I saw 2 monarchs on Monarch's Delight. Now, this is 2014. I had gone all of 2013 without seeing a single monarch. That was the low point in the monarch population. 3.6% of the monarchs left compared to 1976. And this was also June. Now, we don't get monarchs up that far north in June typically. It takes them longer to get up here. I know they come up the Mississippi Valley faster, but so I was really encouraged that just 1 year after the low point, I was seeing monarchs, and it really looked like they were going to survive.
I think it's more of a realization for me
Somebody's
about
got to
our
mute.
life going forward. So, I mean, honestly, Brendan and Colin found partners and they were married and they spent Thanksgiving with their.
Here we go.
That's
Okay.
Trisha.
All right. Back to monarchs. Saw 2 monarchs. Why were they there? They were there because there was Monarch's Delight, but there was another species of milkweed as well. So they had what they needed. They had forage, but they had their host plant. They were there laying eggs. Do you know where I was? I was on the High Line in the middle of Manhattan. This is what the High Line is. If you've never been there, it's
And
a restored elevated
yeah.
railroad that was abandoned for years. Somebody went up there, saw a lot of native plants that had seeded in themselves and said, let's make this a tourist destination. And they did. And it really is a destination. Millions of people visit the High Line every single year. It's 30 feet above the taxis, right in the middle of the heart of Manhattan. Now, this is Rick Dark. He was after me to see the High Line, see all of its wonderful plants for years. I'm not much of a city boy, so I kept putting him off, but finally he got me there, and that's where the monarch's delight was. And immediately I was impressed. There was life there. I didn't think I'd see anything in the middle of Manhattan. Somebody's just finished studying the native bees on the Highland. There's 30 species at this point. So I was totally wrong when I thought there'd be nothing there. It proves that thoughtful native plantings, and the Highline is not 100% native, really can bring life back even to places like the middle of Manhattan. So if we can do it there, we can essentially do it anywhere. But there are 4 things we need to think about in order to be successful. And the first one is we need to shrink the area that's in lawn. And that's because we've got 40 million acres of lawn. That's the size of New England dedicated to a dead status symbol. And I understand we need our status symbols. We have to demonstrate to everybody that we're good citizens. We're playing the cultural game. We're not renegades, and a lawn is a great way to do it. But let's cut that area in half. Let's put some plants in half the area we now have in lawn. We're still going to manicure the part of the lawn that we do keep, so we're still going to be good citizens. We're still going to have high status. But if we replant half the area that's in lawn, that gives us 20 more million acres to use for conservation. And if we do this at home, we can create a new national park that we can call Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. And if we do that, we're immediately going to have a number of benefits. You're putting some part of the natural world right where you live, which allows you to develop for the first time or redevelop, reacquaint yourself with nature. You want that personal relationship with nature, and you can do it at your own time and your own pace. You can do it by avoiding crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, millions of people there. So you're really visiting millions of people. It's also free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed. I don't care what pandemic comes down the road. You can always still go out in your yard. No travel hassles. But, you know, this is the important one. You get to experience the natural world alone and develop that personal relationship. And if we don't do that, the urgency of conservation just never sinks in. This is particularly true for our kids who are going to be the future stewards of our planet. Right now, most of them are suffering from nature deficit disorder. They don't know anything about it. So, you know, we put them on a bus with 30 kids and a teacher and drive them for an hour to a natural area, and then they walk around for an hour. Teacher tells them not to touch anything, and then they get back on the bus and go home. And that's their experience with the natural world. I am sure that's better than nothing. But what they really had an experience with is 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If there's some part of the natural world in their yard, they can simply go outside and discover it all by themselves, alone, no parental supervision. Let them work it out themselves. Maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. And I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very small patch of nature that isn't all that natural. It's grass and a hedge, but there are anoa lizards there. And she's fascinated with them. She has discovered how you hunt them. And she's explained it to me in detail. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so that the lizards don't see you coming. And then you crawl very slowly towards the lizard. No smiling. This is serious stuff. You can wear your best dress, that's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, and there's your personal relationship with that lizard. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be doing this the rest of her life, but I guarantee she will remember hunting lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life. That's the personal relationship we're talking about, which is so important because Zoe and the rest of her peers are going to be the future stewards of the planet. If you want to do more than hunt lizards, or you want your kids to do more, then get this book, Nancy Stranitzky's Nature Play at Home. dozens of wonderful ideas of how to get kids interested in the natural world. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. What are we going to put in the area we take out of lawn? We got to put plants that I call keystone plants. They don't have to be the only plants we put there, but they are essential. What's a keystone plant? Well, one of the most important things we have discovered in our lab in recent years is that not all native plants contribute to food webs equally. Some, actually just a few, 5%, are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs. 14% are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs, which means 85% of our native plants aren't doing all that much in terms of supporting food webs. And food webs are essential. They support everything else. So the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are. But I can construct an all-native landscape that supports almost nothing. And of course, that's not the goal. The question is, do we want ecologically productive plants in our yards to, or any of our human-dominated spaces, to rebuild the natural systems that we need? Or benign plants or ecologically destructive plants like buckthorn that escapes and is biological pollution? The answer should be obvious. I get an email once or twice a year from some people saying, don't I know that ginkgos, ginkgo biloba from Asia, actually grew in North America 7 million years ago? That means they're native, and that means we can plant them and everything will be great. Well, yes, I do know that ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago. We can argue about whether that makes them native today, but I'm not going to bother because that's not our metric. It doesn't matter whether they're native or not. It matters whether they're productive or not. I don't care whether ginkgos grew in the moon 7 million years ago. They support no caterpillars, 0 caterpillars. So if you're trying to build a food web, ginkgos aren't going to do it for you. What is? Well, how about oaks? In 84% of the counties of North America, oaks are the #1 plant genus supporting the caterpillars. 557 species in the mid-Atlantic states, 900 species nationwide, hundreds of species in all the counties that we look at. There's no other plant genus that comes close to our oaks. Here's an example of what keystone oaks are doing in our yard. Now remember, I've taken pictures of 1,028 species of moths so far, and that's not butterflies. I haven't gotten to the butterflies yet. So out of the 1,028 species, 903 of them have known host plants. So there's what, 125, I don't know what they eat yet. Of the 903 species, 265 species use oaks. And we've got 69 genera of native woody plants on our property, and only one of which is the oaks, the quercus. And we have hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants, which means oaks represent less than 1.5% of all of our woody plant diversity and way less than 1% of our total plant diversity. But they're supporting at least 29%, almost 30% of our moth species diversity, and which contribute to probably most of the birds that are breeding here. Imagine how less diverse our property would be if we took that one keystone plant out of our yard. That's the power of keystone plants. How do you find out what your keystone plants are? You go to Native Plant Finder, National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of woody and herbaceous plants for your county will pop up. And it'll look something like this. They're ranked in terms of the number of caterpillars they support in your county. So quercus is almost always #1 in wherever you are, followed by prunus and salix, very close behind. Hickories are high, and then we go down to a number of other genera. And I stopped here because I just ran out of room. Now notice I say native oaks, native cherries, native maples, native pines. That's because you can go to the nursery, and if you say, give me a pine, they'll give you a Japanese pine. Give me a maple, they'll give you a Japanese maple. Give me a cherry, they'll give you some Chinese flowering cherry. Specify that you want a native species that belongs to these native genera, because if you don't get a native species, it's going to reduce caterpillar use on average by 68%. We've done that experiment and measured it. Here are the top ranked herbaceous plants, and of course you've got so many species working for you there with your great prairie species. But solidago goldenrods are always way up at the top. Our native asters, our native helianthus, the sunflowers. Well, all of helianthus are native, but get the straight species, the perennial ones. Not only are they supporting a lot of caterpillars, but they're also the top genera in terms of supporting specialist bees. Those 3 genera alone will support over 40 species of specialist bees that can't reproduce on any other types of pollen. And that's 40 species of bees that you won't have as an option in your yard if you don't have those 3 genera. That's the power of keystone plants. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in the keystone plants, attract lots of insects to our property, and then we're going to kill them with our security light at night. And of course, that is not the goal. There's a lot of research these days suggesting that light pollution, and the research, much of it is coming from Europe, but light pollution is turning out to be one of the major causes of insect declines worldwide. We've been wondering why insects, particularly moths, go to lights at night for 100 years, and we still don't know why. But when they do go, they die from a number of causes. One of them is exhaustion. The moth will fly around and around the light until it's totally exhausted. It'll collide with the light and get killed, get incinerated, die of dehydration. The bat comes and picks it off. A lot of nocturnal insects are blinded by bright lights. Who knew? And then, of course, they're not doing what they ought to be doing, and that's foraging and mating and reproducing. To me, this is actually good news. So here's a major cause of insect declines. It's good news because it is so easy to reverse. Just turn off your lights. But I know what you're going to say. You can't turn off your light at night because then the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on your light so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to notice is how often the bad man does not come. And if you don't want to do that, take the white light out of your security light. The mercury vapor light is the very worst. And put in a yellow bulb. Yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to insects for some reason, and yellow LED lights are the least attractive. So if we were all to switch to yellow LED lights overnight, we would save billions of insects and a whole lot of energy. It seems like a no-brainer to me. The next thing we have to do, the final thing we have to do, is to landscape in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from the tree. Then it emerges as an adult and does it all over again. But that's rare. Most of them, 94%, 480 species, drop from the tree after they finish growing as a caterpillar, and they wiggle their way below the ground and pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter under the tree. And then that's how they complete their development until they emerge as an adult. The problem, of course, is that we don't have any leaf litter under our trees, and we compact the soil by mowing it and trampling it to the point where it's so hard the caterpillar can't get below the ground. So this becomes an ecological trap. The moths come in, lay their eggs here, the caterpillars develop, the caterpillars drop down and die. Then the next generation is smaller, and the generation after that is gone altogether. I am convinced that this type of landscaping, which is everywhere, is another major cause of insect decline. And of course, the cement landscape is even less of a viable option for moths. I'm not trying to discourage the use of trees in cities. I'm trying to discourage the use of the profligate use of cement as a default landscape. We know, it destroys watersheds. That's just laziness. This is what we typically do. We put a tree in the middle of a big lawn. Nobody has studied how well caterpillars survive in a situation like this. I wanted to do that this summer, but COVID said, not this summer. But I guarantee they survive better in a situation like this, where you have a tree and then a layered landscape. Maybe you have a dogwood over here, and then followed by a native azalea, and then ferns and other ground covers. The caterpillar drops down into a very safe situation. There's lots of leaf litter down there to spin its cocoon. The soil is very loose. You can get below the ground. Nobody's going to mow it. Nobody's going to walk on it. Survivorship will be much higher. This is where we can do our spring ephemeral gardening. And this is how you shrink the lawn. You put a big bed around your tree and create these safe sites for the caterpillars. This is where you put your ground covers, things like wild ginger, ferns. Here it is in a very formal setting. Ferns, look at all those safe sites for those caterpillars, much better than cement. And other types of ground covers, foam flower, mayapple, native pachysandra, all those things are great places to expand the flower beds and reduce the area that's in lawn. Okay. Another grad student, Desiree Narango, worked with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and came up with some very interesting conclusions. But one of them, to me, is that there actually is room for compromise in our plant choices. And I think that's going to be very valuable. What she did was compare chickadee population growth rates in landscapes that were dominated by native plants. None of them had all native plants, or dominated by introduced plants, and many of them had all introduced plants. And the first thing she found was that when they were dominated by introduced plants, there were 75% fewer caterpillars. So the amount of food for the breeding chickadees was reduced by 75%. They were also 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. There's a nest box in every single yard, but the chickadees came, looked around, and said, there's not enough to eat here. We're not even going to try. If they did try, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive, to make it to fledging. If they did, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And you might say, well, those aren't huge differences. But if you put all that together in a population growth model, this is what you get as a function of the percentage of woody non-native plant biomass in your yard, from no woody non-natives to 100% woody non-natives. This dotted line is replacement rate. This is the rate at which the population has to reproduce in order to replace the adults that die every year. If you make that many babies, then your population is not growing, but it's not shrinking either. That's a sustainable population. If you make more babies than adults die, you've got a growing population. But if you make fewer, anything below this dotted line, you've got a shrinking population, an unsustainable population. Right here is where those lines overlap. So what this suggests is, as soon as you exceed 30% of your plant biomass being non-native, so you get up into this zone here, you're down in the unsustainable part of this graph. And we've measured the percentage of non-native plants in the landscapes where I live in Northeast Maryland, Southeast Pennsylvania, and Delaware. 82% of the plants are from Asia, so way down over here. Well, I'm excited about this for two reasons. First of all, this is the first time that this has been measured for any plant or any bird anywhere. So anybody who doubts that your plant choice actually have a big impact on the life around you, go to this study and check it out. But this is the area of compromise that I was talking about. You can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native and still have a viable bird population, which to me is good news, because we all love our non-native plants. And if I said you can't have a single non-native plant, very few people would be listening to me. So you can have your crepe myrtle, you can have your ginkgo, as long as it's not an invasive plant. You may not have your buckthorn or your burning bush or your barberry or all those guys, your Callery pear. But the other ones that are well behaved, you can have them without destroying your breeding bird population, as long as it's less than 30% of the woody plant biomass. Can native plants be used in formal landscapes? Of course they can. This is a formal garden in North Carolina. Somebody sent me this picture. What they're doing is replacing the typical non-native plants with natives. Here's Joe Pye. Notice I didn't call it Joe Pye weed. It's not a weed. A weed's a plant out of place, by the way, and our native plants are not out of place. And the goal is to replace all of these with native plants, and then send me another picture. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. And I guess that's okay, because they're non-natives over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a typical suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Put a little fence around it. And that's beautiful. There's several species here, meeting the needs of several species of bees. Now, it's not very big, but if everybody did this as a matter of course, our bees would be in much better shape. Let's remember why we need pollinators. It's really not because of what you hear. It's, we say, oh, they pollinate a third of our crops. It's really about 1/12 of our crops. But that makes people think if they don't live next to a farm field, they don't need any pollinators. Not so. We need pollinators because they pollinate, 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we would lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. Not an option. That is simply not an option. Where do we need these pollinators? Everywhere. everywhere where you need plants, including our yards. How about this design by Drew Latham? Much bigger. Imagine, compare the amount of life that is here with the amount of life that is here. That's a beautiful lawn, but it's dead. 0 versus a lot. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can, and there are more and more examples where this is happening. You folks probably know some that I haven't heard of. Minnesota, for example, has a cost-sharing program to encourage homeowners to replace some or all of their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants, and people are doing it. Works well. You get paid to do it. There's an island in Florida that's paying its citizens to allow burrowing owls, a listed species, to burrow in their front yards. If you have a burrowing owl, you get paid for it. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. You get paid to protect an endangered species on your property. Everybody would want one. Missouri had a bounty on calorie pears, one of our most invasive ornamentals that we're still selling, amazingly. So if you prove that you took out a calorie pear, they gave you a free tree replacement. And Fayetteville, Arkansas has the same program right now. A water utility in San Antonio gives people $100 coupons to put in water efficient native plants in their dry habitat. And then of course, there's all the lawn replacement programs in the far West, particularly California. Get rid of your lawn, you get up to $2 per square foot rebate if you put in xeric plant and get rid of that thirsty lawn. I think we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the first one is that we've assumed that nature is important, but not essential. We like nature, we like to see it, we want to have it around us. But if it's not essential, that means when push comes to shove, when resources are short, which is always, nature loses. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there was this wall-sized poster that said, we need to save wildlife for future generations. And I hear our top conservation biologists talk this way because it's true. We want our kids, we want other generations to appreciate the natural world. It was Teddy Roosevelt's main rationale for creating the national park system. We want to save it for future generations. But to me, that suggests nature is there just for entertainment. It is far more than that. We do want to save it for future generations, but we need to save nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, I mentioned this. If we restrict conservation efforts to untouched areas or areas with very few humans, we've condemned them to failure because those areas will be too small and too isolated to sustain the species we need them to sustain. David Quammen has a superb analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That is 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And this is exactly what we've done to our ecosystems. Fragmented them, put no man's land in between each fragment. It's been devastating. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I hate that language because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including all of our human-dominated landscapes. So what we need to do is put the plants back in between those fragments. We need to glue our rug back together again. Create intact, functional ecosystems by putting particularly those keystone plants, the very powerhouses, into those no-man lands. We're not just building biological corridors so plants and animals can move back and forth between good habitat. We're creating good habitat where we live. This means we're going to have to start sharing our spaces with nature. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few ecologists, a few conservation biologists. We didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being on the planet, but I have no idea why, because every human being on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody bear responsibility for good Earth stewardship? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said that the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with these mindsets, you're taught them. We are very good at teaching this one. We have been terrible at teaching what our obligations for good Earth stewardship really are. It doesn't mean that you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you really can save it where you live. This approach empowers each one of us, and I'm excited about it for that very reason. You know, right now, so many of us feel powerless because the Earth's problems are so huge. They feel overwhelming. It's very easy to feel like one person cannot make a difference. But in fact, in this area, one person can make a difference. Go out and plant that oak. Get rid of your buckthorn. Plant any of the keystone plants. Cut the area of lawn in half. Put in a pollinator garden. And believe me, you will have restored a piece of the earth. You can see the difference almost immediately, and you'll have done it as one person. It makes you an important cog in the future wheel of conservation. It also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't worry about the entire planet's problem. Just worry about the piece of it that you can impact. If you own property, that's obvious. That's where you start. And again, east of the Mississippi, 85% of us own property. We'd be 85% done if we all took care of our properties. If you don't own property, you can volunteer and help somebody who does. Help your neighbor who can't handle it. Help your local land conservancy who needs help. The wonderful volunteer programs that you have around your slough. I mean, that's a perfect example. So as property owners or as volunteers, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and ultimately our own fate. Now, I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much. I'm happy to take questions now.
All right, Mr. Tallamy, I will check the chat and read the questions to you, unless you want to look at the chat yourself.
No, I want you to read them to me.
All right. Let me get through all of the wonderful remarks. What are some native shrubs or perennials that support caterpillars that will grow under shade trees?
Okay, that's a good question. One that is that blooms really readily in the shade is our native hydrangea arborescens, but you have to be careful when you go to buy it because they often, they try to sell you the cultivar Annabelle, but the cultivar has taken the reproductive parts of the flower and turned them into bracts. So it's a bigger, it looks like a typical showy hydrangea, but you've lost all the important pollinator value of that plant. So if you get the straight species, hydrangea arborescens, it'll bloom in pretty heavy shade. It's very impressive that way. Of course, the spring ephemerals that I talked about, they all are up doing their thing before the leaves are even out. So you actually have sun and shady areas early in the season. So you can plant any of those. I mentioned witch hazel earlier on. I mean, that blooms in the fall, again, after the leaves have fallen. So shade is not an issue there. Typically, shade does reduce blooms, but your plants can be functional even if they're not blooming. They can grow under there, be happy. They just won't bloom a lot. In the back of the living landscape that I contributed chapters to with Rick Dark, there are extensive plant lists that for each area of the country that are specified for particular yard conditions. So, shady areas, wet areas, canopy trees, shrubs. So consult the list in the back of the living landscape and you'll get lots of examples of plants that'll do well in shade.
All right, next question. What can we do about people who are feeding wild cats?
Ooh. Well, we shouldn't have wild cats at all. Cats are wonderful pets, but they should be kept inside. And the reason I say that is because the research has shown they're killing 2 to 3 billion birds a year, which is about the same number of birds that we've lost over the last 50 years. That's a third of the North American bird population. So, and people say, well, it's only natural. the unnatural part of it is that the house cat was not part of our fauna in North America. And we also subsidize them. You know, they're doing it because it is, you know, it's part of their instinct to kill things, but then they go in and get a big meal at home. So it's not a survival mechanism. The neuter the cat and put them out for, you know, wild colonies is a terrible idea from the wildlife perspective, because they're just slaughtering everything around them. So it's a very emotional issue. Peter Mara, who wrote a book called Cat Wars, immediately got death threats. I guess that's what we do in this country now. We just threaten everybody with death if we don't like, which reminds me of some other countries actually. But ecologically, cats outside are a disaster.
What are the best oaks?
The best oaks. Can I tell you, in January, we actually have a study. I've got a student working on that right now, comparing about 16 species of oaks. None of them are in the live oak group, so we won't know about that. But they will be ranked, but I don't expect huge differences among these species, because the insects that eat oaks are all adapted to tannins. That's the primary defense of oaks. And if you can handle tannins from one oak, you can handle them from other oaks. So typically insects that eat oaks can eat a lot of different oaks. I do predict that the white oak group will have a slight edge over the red oak group. And I also predict that one of the most commonly planted oaks today, the swamp white oak, is going to end up at the bottom, because its leaves are very thick and very fuzzy. And those trichomes on the leaves discourage caterpillars quite a bit. Those are predictions, but we will know probably in January. But don't worry too much about that. Plant the oak that's appropriate for your area. It's, you know, bur oak is certainly one that you should think about. And the insects in your area will be adapted to that.
All right, another question. What is the value of pokeweed for insects and birds?
Value of pokeweed for insects is very low. Very few things eat pokeweed. It came up with agriculture from the southern states. So it's really not a long-term native in the north. It does make berries that the birds love, so they like those berries. But in terms of food web value for insects, it's very low. So it's one of those natives that would not be contributing very much.
All right. Another comment. Taking out all natives, it seems overwhelming for me to come up with a plan to start plants. My yard is only 50 by 75.
So what's the question? How do you do that?
I think your comment is it's overwhelming. Like, where would she start?
I would start by just adding a tree and then build a bed around it. You could even start and stop with that. You've added a very valuable part to your yard, and particularly if it's not a very big yard. That tree's going to grow. It's going to produce a lot of biomass. Make it a keystone plant, and you've done a wonderful thing there. You'll also reduce the amount of area that you have in lawn. And if you're tired after that, you can stop. But you might say, "Hey, that was fun. I'll do it again." And it doesn't have to, don't plant trees big, plant them as small as possible, because they will then develop the healthiest root system and live a lot longer, and they'll be a whole lot cheaper. The only downside to that is then you do have to protect them from deer when they're young.
All right. Someone's asking, I would like my school district to begin replacing parts of their extensive unused lawn into native perennials, but they are not open to the idea. They're worried about mow lines, also worried about maintenance. How can I persuade them to add native perennials?
Worry about mole lines?
Mow lines. Yeah, that, I don't know what she's.
The moles are going to trip people or something?
Oh, mow, like mowing.
Oh.
Lawn lines.
Mow.
All right.
Well, now they got to mow the whole thing. So what are they? This is a common problem. Everybody's budget is stretched. They typically have, one land or, one guy who's maintaining the land. And when you start adding things, he gets all upset. Oh, I can't get the mower around. It's going to be harder. Adding these plants can be labor intensive, but once they're established, it actually reduces maintenance. So that could be an argument. You can actually save money over time. You want to design it so that those mowers that they do ride can get everywhere they need to get, but they're not going to mow as much, and you're going to be well planted in other areas. But what probably will convince them is to actually turn that landscape over to a bunch of volunteers like local master gardener groups. It can be an excellent, there's no doubt it's a wonderful educational tool for the kids in that school. Every grade can use that landscape in a you know, productive way to teach them different things, and every subject can take advantage of that. But you know, they all feel stressed, so approach it from their own perspective, realizing that, uh-oh, here's one more thing you're asking me to do, and I don't have time to even answer my emails. So give them a mechanism for doing it that won't cost a lot of money, and then they'll say yes.
Right. Also, the Prospect Heights Natural Resource Commission has a Grow It, Don't Mow It program. So contact them at info@phnrc.com for help and advice, and they'll give you some more advice.
Right. I apologize. I called you Prospect Park before. It's Prospect Heights. I'm sorry.
Another person said, in small yards, how can we keep our fallen leaves in the garden beds without blowing into the lawn or neighbors' lawns? I thought I was doing great mulching my leaves and keeping them, but aren't I destroying some insects by mulching the leaves?
Yes, you are. Yeah, you just ground up that Luna moth that has a cocoon lying in the leaves. Yeah, people worry about that. You know what happens is once the leaves fall and you get some rain on them, they settle down. But it is a blowy period in the beginning there. That can be an issue. You want to, the eventual bed that you're putting them in should be well planted with shrubs and ground cover that grabs onto those leaves. If it's just bare ground with leaves, you're right, the leaves blow around a lot. And you know, I don't want to minimize this because that isn't an issue. But the thinking now is to treat your leaves the same way we treat water. The you know, the best practices for water management is to keep every drop of water that falls on your property and let it seep in. Same thing with leaves. Every leaf that falls in your property should stay on your property, let it degrade there and return the nutrients that are in those leaves to the soil, build up the organic matter in the soil. So that's what we want to do. My son bought a new house a couple years ago, and he called me up the first fall and he said, Dad, I've got too many leaves. And I said, put them in your flower beds. He said, I don't have enough flower beds. I said, exactly. That's the solution to leaves, is have bigger flower beds that can take them all. What do you do with those blower guys? I don't know. If you do grind them up though, you are going to kill some insects. So, you know, life is full of trade-offs.
All right. Another person says, thank you. You've inspired me to take half my 1 acre lawn, create perennial pollinating gardens. What book recommendations would you suggest in addition to The Living Landscape?
Well, don't forget Nature's Best Hope. That's the latest in terms of our research. If you're looking for types of plants, there are a number of books that list native plants in various regions. You've got you know, you've got wild ones that can give you all kinds of literature. You've got the Prospect Heights newsletter that Dana writes. There's a lot of, you know, the Google is full of information these days. But go slowly, pick at it, you know, make a single goal. The fall is a great time to plant, but not now. We've passed that point. It's getting too late. But the spring is another option. But you don't have to do it all at once. How's that for a non-answer?
Is there any value to the hated creeping Charlie?
Any value? Yeah. You know, it's a ground cover, so you could argue it's better than bare soil, but there's so many other things that are better than bare soil. I'm very close to saying no, there's no value. It creeps, it just keeps going, nothing eats it. So it is much better to get rid of it totally so it doesn't keep growing and put in a much better ground cover. And you know, ground covers do not have to be monocultures. They can be a variety of plants that replace each other. If you have mayapple, for example, it dies back later in the summer, and then other things would come along. Everybody ignores native pachysandra. It's a wonderful ground cover. But a ground cover of a variety of spring ephemerals works really well. And ground covers don't have to be short. Ground covers can be shrubs. They can be 2 or 3 feet tall. Be creative.
All right, it says, what perennials should we not cut down in the fall? I understand some insects lay their eggs in certain perennials in the fall.
Yes, they do. So your prairie plants, you have all those standing dead stalks that everybody, they look dead. They're, functionally they're dead. The living part of the plant is now roots underground, but they're still performing valuable roles. First of all, at the top of all those dead stalks are seeds. And those are the seeds that are supporting the wintering birds in your area that don't go to feeders. None of our sparrows go to feeders, and juncos only occasionally go to feeders. They're living off the seeds that are at the top of those seed heads. So if you cut them all down in the fall, you've just removed bird food that could otherwise be very valuable. In the stems are field katydid eggs, lots of other types of eggs, and a lot of overwintering bees. So it is far better to, and people say, well, if I cut it down in the spring, that'll be great. If you cut it down in March, for example, you have fed the birds. That's great, but you're still eliminating all the eggs that field katydid and your native bees. The best way to deal with those stalks is to only remove 1/3 of them each year, so that the 2/3 remain standing, and they will contribute living things to your yard as soon as other green material pops up. Heather Holm has discovered that our native bees spend the winter in the stalks of plants that grew the year before. So that means they have to stand there for more than a year before the bees actually use them. But she's also discovered that you can, if you cut them off maybe 2 feet, so that there's 2 feet remaining, but if it's a 5-foot stalk, you've gotten rid of a lot of it. That's where a lot of the bees nest. They're within 2 feet of the ground. So that's somewhat of a compromise. Logically, we're thinking that if you cut them off at the ground and tie them up in the middle, like the corn stalk, Halloween decorations, and stand them up somewhere in the backyard, that maybe they're used very effectively there. That should work. I don't think anybody's actually measured it, but that should work. So in a sensitive part of your front yard, you want to get rid of that, try that. Just stack, don't lay them flat because they'll get all rotten under the snow and something. Stand them up somewhere in your backyard.
All right. Once you remove an invasive plant like burning bush, how do you dispose of it so it won't grow back? Do you have to bag up every branch and put it in the trash?
Burning bush is not very sensitive that way. It depends on what the species is. Something like Japanese knotweed, that is a problem, because a piece of it, the size of your pinky fingernail, can start a new plant. But burning bush or autumn lot, all those woody guys, you cut them off. If you kill the root system in any number of ways, the part of the plant that you've cut off, unless it's loaded with viable seeds, is not going to be a problem. I just stack them up and they rot down very, very quickly. So the best time to get rid of them is when they're not loaded with viable seeds. So if they are, I don't know, burn them. But probably, putting them in a compost heap when they're not dead probably will spread them.
All right. So another question is, so there's no value with daylilies or hostas?
I would put them in that 30% of our non-natives that are not invasive. Well, daylilies can be a little invasive, but not too much. That are giving us aesthetic pleasure. So in terms of wildlife value, yeah, the wildlife value is extremely low. But we do, we like neat, beautiful landscapes. They are not the top offenders. So if you really want one, that's fine. Just make sure that the 2/3 of your yard has much more productive plants in it, and you'll be okay.
That was our last question. A few people wanted me to repeat the name of your book is Nature's Best Hope. And they were also asking about the title of the child's book that you recommended in the presentation. I believe it's
Nature Play?
Nature Play, yeah.
Yeah, Nancy Stranisti.
Oh, there, one more question came in. Including plum and peach trees in the backyard, are they helpful for birds and insects?
Well, American plum is, they're both prunus. American plum is a great plant for pollinators, and it is a prunus, so it's very high ranked for insects, yes. Peach also supplies, it's another prunus, and it's a lot of insects eat it. But if you're actually growing it for peaches, it means you're probably spraying it about 15 times. So it's not going to be all that productive for insects. But, if it's just there and things will eat it. Yep.
Dana from the Prospect Heights Natural Resource Commission mentioned, don't forget bringing nature home. Someone also is asking, how do we protect from viburnum beetles?
Yeah, viburnum leaf beetle. It's an invasive species from Europe, I believe. So when I say we need a lot of insects in our ecosystems, I am not talking about non-native insects. They're here without their natural enemies. They run amok. They kill our plants. So viburnum leaf beetle, gypsy moth, Japanese beetle, hemlock woolly adelgids, emerald ash borer. We don't want any of them. How do you protect your plants? It's a huge problem. The best way historically has turned out to be biological control, where we bring over some natural enemies that are specific to those pests and they bring them under control. It's hard to do, usually takes decades to work. I don't think anybody's working on the viburnum leaf beetle. But there are a few invasive insects like the brown marmorated stink bug, for example, where they peak, they go crazy, and then they fall off in numbers for some reason, and they actually seem to blend in with other species without being so destructive. And there's some evidence that viburnum leaf beetle is starting to do that. I have viburnum leaf beetle at home, but it has never defoliated my viburnums. I do when I walk by, I squish them, but not enough to really make a big difference. So I hope next year they don't defoliate me and make me sound crazy. But I know farther north they're more of a problem. A lot of people say, well, I'm not going to plant viburnums anymore. Viburnums are really powerful bushes that we don't want to give in to all these things and just eliminate the powerhouses that are running our ecosystems. So that's why we don't want to bring these insects in. But
someone is also asking about apple trees, and then can peach trees be grown without spraying?
They can be grown without spraying, but you won't get a lot of peaches. The fruits, there's a lot of diseases on peach trees, primarily diseases, and growing organic peaches, boy, that's tough. It's like growing organic apples. People do manage to do that. I'm not sure how, but apple trees, it's Malus. We have native crab apples in the genus Malus that even though apple trees themselves are not native, it's in a native genus, and a number of things do eat it. We also brought in a number of non-native apple moths that attack apple trees. But that means they're actually producing a lot of moth biomass that the birds do use. So it's hard on in terms of growing apples, but they can be valuable plants from that perspective.
Is neem oil good for protection from Japanese beetles?
That's neem oil, and I guess you're talking about spraying the plants so the beetles won't eat them. You know what? I've never tried it. I've never heard of anybody who's tried it. So I don't know, but it could be. It's a natural product produced from the neem tree that is protective against insects. So, Japanese beetle populations they come and they go. They rarely outbreak here in Southeast Pennsylvania, but when they do, we have to deal with it. But you can go years without having a lot of them. If you're having a big problem, give it a try, see what happens.
All right.
You know what can work for Japanese beetles? If they're hanging on your sycamore leaves or something, they have a funny behavior where they will mate and eat at the same time, and they get these huge aggregations on single leaves. You get a bucket of warm soapy water and put it under there and just tap the leaf. They all fall in, and it seems like, oh, that'll take a long time. You can actually get a lot of beetles in a very short period of time. Just walk around every afternoon and tap them in, and that'll really knock that population down. And you're not using any insecticides. Very quick.
That's what I do. I make it a game to see how many I can have in my jar by the end of the summer. It's terrible, but it works.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That was all of the questions we've had so far. There were a lot of comments. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Brilliant, fantastic program. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you. I think you've inspired a lot of us.
Great.
To go out there and make our own homegrown national park.
There you go. There you go.
All right.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.